The Mongol Empire, the world conquerors from the steppe. At its zenith in the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was an unparalleled historical phenomenon, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. This colossal realm stretched from the Sea of Japan in the east to the gates of Central Europe in the west, and from the Siberian taiga in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. It encompassed over 12 million square miles, connecting a dizzying array of civilizations, from the Chinese dynasties to the Islamic caliphates to the kingdoms of Christendom. But how did a collection of fractious, nomadic tribes from the harsh steppes of Central Asia suddenly erupt onto the world stage to dominate nearly the entire known world? This narrative explores the extraordinary strategies, devastating conflicts, and unique historical circumstances that enabled this unprecedented explosion of power. We will examine the military genius and revolutionary reforms of Genghis Khan, which forged the Mongols into an unstoppable force. Along the way, we will encounter the immense cultural exchange this empire facilitated, the fierce resistance it faced, and the internal fractures that eventually led to its fragmentation. Understanding the Mongol Empire is crucial for comprehending the medieval world and the foundations of the modern era. Its legacy reshaped global demographics, redrew the political map of Asia and Europe, and ignited an unprecedented period of transcontinental trade and cultural diffusion known as the Pax Mongolica. By exploring this complex and often terrifying history, we gain insights into the dynamics of empire, the power of adaptation, and the forces of connectivity that first truly globalized the Eurasian world. The early beginnings, the steppe and the tribes. Before the rise of the Mongols, the vast Eurasian steppe was a world unto itself, a seemingly endless sea of grass stretching from Manchuria to Hungary. This harsh environment, with its extreme temperatures, scarce resources, and nomadic lifestyle, was the crucible that forged the world's most formidable horsemen and archers. Life on the steppe was defined by the horse and the herd. The climate was one of brutal extremes, scorching, dusty summers where temperatures could soar, and bitterly cold winters where winds howled across the frozen plains, a season known as the Jude, which could wipe out entire herds and spell doom for a tribe. Survival depended on constant movement, in search of pasture for their sheep, goats, horses, and camels. Nomadic tribes, the Tatars, Karaites, Naimans, Merkits, and many others, lived in portable felt tents called gurs, which were perfectly designed for their life. Warm, sturdy, and easily dismantled for migration. Their diet consisted largely of meat and dairy products from their herds. Aragag, fermented mare's milk, was a staple drink. This was a life that bred incredible toughness, resilience, and a deep familiarity with warfare, which was a constant feature of steppe life. For centuries, these tribes fought amongst themselves in a cycle of raids, revenge, and fleeting alliances. Conflicts erupted over grazing rights, stolen livestock, personal slights, or the ambition of a particular chieftain. They were a constant, low-level threat to the settled civilizations on their borders, particularly China, which had built its Great Wall precisely to keep such barbarians at bay. But they were never unified. They were a storm of scattered factions, powerful in their individual skills, but politically impotent on the world stage. They were viewed by their settled neighbors as backward and chaotic, a force of nature to be contained, rather than a political entity to be engaged with. This was the world into which Temujin, the future Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 near the Onon River in modern-day Mongolia. His early life was one of extreme hardship and tragedy, a brutal education in the realities of steppe politics. His father, Yesigey, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan who had just captured Temujin's mother, Herlun, from another tribe. Yesagay named his son after a Tatar chieftain he had just captured, a common practice, but one that foreshadowed a life of conflict with that tribe. When Temujin was only 9, his father was poisoned by rival Tatars after sharing a meal with them. The family's fortunes collapsed immediately. Abandoned by their tribe, who saw no use in following a widow and her young children, Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were left to die on the steppe. They were forced to eke out a meager existence on the margins, hunting for rodents and fishing for their survival. It was during this time that Temujin killed his half-brother Bedtime in a fight over food and status, a stark demonstration of his ruthless will to survive and his understanding that leadership required the elimination of rivals. He experienced betrayal, was captured and enslaved by the Tai-Chud clan, a humiliating experience from which he made a daring escape. These formative years forged in him a ruthless will to survive, a deep understanding of the brutal politics of the steppe, and a burning desire for revenge and order. He learned that in a world of shifting loyalties, ultimate reliance could only be placed on one's immediate family and a few trusted companions, his no-cut band of brothers. Through sheer charisma, cunning, and martial prowess, the young Temujin began his long climb to power. His first major step was to reconnect with his father's ally, Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Karite tribe, to whom Yesagay had sworn an oath of friendship. Temujin presented himself as a loyal vassal, offering Togrul a priceless gift, a sable coat that Herlan had given him. This act of fealty secured him a powerful patron. He slowly built a following, attracting other outcasts and ambitious warriors to his banner. His personal magnetism was immense. He inspired fierce loyalty. He reforged old alliances, most significantly with his childhood friend Jamuka, with whom he swore an oath of Anda, or blood brotherhood. Together, they fought to reclaim Herlun's kidnapped honor and to build a power base. Temujin's rise was not linear. He suffered defeats, most notably at the hands of Jamuka himself. Their alliance shattered, likely due to Jamuka's jealousy and traditionalist views, clashing with Temujin's meritocratic approach. At the Battle of Dalan Baljat, Jamuka's forces inflicted a serious defeat on Temujin, forcing him to retreat and rebuild. But with each setback, he adapted. His strategy was to break with steppe tradition. Instead of elevating his allies to rule conquered tribes as vassals, he integrated them directly into his own growing structure. He broke up conquered tribes and distributed their people among his own units, destroying old clan loyalties. He promoted based on merit and loyalty rather than solely on noble birth, rewarding those who served him well regardless of their origin. This innovative policy created a powerful, centralized force with unwavering loyalty to him personally. One by one, he subdued the rival tribes. The Tatars, who had killed his father, were crushed in a meticulously planned campaign. Temujin ordered a general massacre of all Tatar men taller than a cart axle, incorporating the women and children into his own tribe. The powerful Karites, after a fallout with Togrul, were defeated in a nighttime battle and absorbed. The Naimans and Merkits were next to fall. Finally, his former friend and rival, Jamuka, was betrayed by his own men, who delivered him to Temujin. In a final act of respect and ruthlessness, Temujin offered his Anda, a noble death, without bloodshed, a privilege reserved for royalty, before executing the traitors who had betrayed their lord, declaring he wanted no disloyal men in his service. By 1206, the unthinkable had been achieved. At a great assembly, or Kurultai, held at the headwaters of the Onon River, the united tribes of the Mongol steppe proclaimed Temujin their universal ruler. He was given the title Genghis Khan, often translated as Oceanic Khan, or firm, resolute ruler. The scattered storm of the steppe had been consolidated into a single terrifying hurricane, its energy focused and directed by a single, indomitable will. The world was about to feel its force. The rise of Genghis Khan, forging the Mongol war machine. The Kurultai of 1206 was more than a coronation. It was a revolutionary event that transformed Mongol society and created the instrument of conquest that would shatter empires. Genghis Khan did not merely unite the tribes. He dismantled the old clannish social order and rebuilt it from the ground up into a disciplined, meritocratic, and fanatically loyal military state. His vision was to create a unified nation where loyalty to the state and the Khan superseded all ancient tribal affiliations. His first act was to break the power of the old tribal aristocracy. He abolished traditional tribal and clan labels, reorganizing his entire people into a decimal-based military structure. The entire nation was divided into units of 10, Arban, 100, Yagan, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen, each with a commander appointed by Genghis himself based on ability and loyalty, not lineage. This system ensured that loyalty was directed upward to the Khan, not sideways to a clan chief. It created a fluid, flexible army that could be easily commanded, deployed, and reconstituted even after heavy losses. A Tumen, comprising 10,000 warriors, was a formidable combined arms force in itself, capable of operating independently for extended periods. The core of this new army was the Mongol cavalryman. From childhood, Mongols were practically born in the saddle. They were expert horsemen, capable of riding for days with minimal rest, surviving on a diet of dried meat and curds, and even sleeping on horseback. They were master archers, who could accurately fire kopom bows from horseback at a full gallop, forward, backward, and to the sides, the famous Hafian shot. Their kopom bow, made from layers of sinew, horn, and wood, was a technological marvel, small enough to use on horseback, yet more powerful than the longbows of Europe, with a range exceeding 300 meters. Each rider maintained a string of small, tough ponies, switching mounts throughout a march to preserve their energy, allowing the army to cover astonishing distances of 60 to 100 miles per day. Genghis Khan honed this innate skill into a devastating military doctrine. The Mongol army was built around speed, deception, intelligence, and overwhelming force. Their primary tactic was the feigned retreat. A unit would attack, then pretend to break and flee in disorder, luring the enemy into a reckless pursuit that would break their formation. The fleeing Mongols would then lead them into a prepared ambush, where fresh troops awaited. They used complex maneuvers, enveloping enemies with fast-moving columns that could coordinate over vast distances using flags, smoke signals, and relay riders. They were masters of intelligence and psychological warfare. Before any campaign, merchants, diplomats, and spies were sent ahead of the army to gather information on terrain, politics, enemy strengths, and weaknesses. They spread terrifying rumors of Mongol invincibility and the horrific fate that awaited those who resisted, aiming to paralyze opponents with fear before a single arrow was loosed. This emphasis on intelligence was a key component of their success, making them one of the best-informed armies in history. Another revolutionary aspect was the incorporation of foreign expertise. Unlike many conquerors, the Mongols were supremely pragmatic. They had no prejudice against adopting new ideas and technologies from their enemies. As they conquered engineers, siege warfare experts, and artisans from China and the Muslim world, they integrated them into their armies. Soon, the nomadic horse archers were supplemented by specialized units of Chinese artillerymen and Muslim engineers who could build and operate trebuchets, catapults, and other siege engines capable of reducing the strongest fortified cities. They even learned to divert rivers and build dams to flood out stubborn defenders. Discipline was savage and absolute. The Yasa, The legal code promulgated by Genghis Khan governed every aspect of military and civilian life. It was a code designed for a nation at war. Desertion, disobedience, or cowardice in battle were punishable by death for an individual. If a whole unit fled, the entire unit was executed. Theft within the tribe and adultery were also harshly punished. Conversely, the laws also promoted religious tolerance for Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists, protected trade routes from banditry, and ensured a fair distribution of spoils among all warriors, not just the nobility. This strict but fair code created a society that was incredibly disciplined and orderly, a stark contrast to the chaotic and fractured world they set out to conquer. By 1206, Genghis Khan had at his command a nation in arms, a highly mobile, superbly disciplined, brilliantly led, and technologically advanced military force, united by a powerful ideology of a divine mandate to conquer the world under the eternal blue heaven. They were lean, hardened by the steppe, and motivated by the promise of plunder, status, and glory under their unparalleled leader. Only once it doesn't happen, a time waged even. The settled, fractured civilizations on their borders, for all their wealth and culture, were complacent, internally divided, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. The Mongol war machine was built, and it was time to set it in motion. The conquest of northern China and the Jin dynasty. With his steppe base secured and his army organized, Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. The first and most logical target was the Jurchen Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin, who had themselves conquered northern China from the Song dynasty a century earlier, were rich, powerful, and arrogant. They ruled over millions of Chinese subjects from their capital, Zhengdu, modern Beijing, and held vast wealth in their cities. Their army was large, equipped with iron armor, and experienced in warfare. For the Mongols, the Jin were also a hated enemy. The Jin emperors had long pursued a policy of divide et impera, playing the steppe tribes off against each other with titles and gifts, keeping them weak and divided. They had even executed a Mongol Khan, Ambagai, by crucifying him on a wooden donkey. The campaign against the Jin, which began in 1211, was the Mongols' first major war against a large, sophisticated, sedentary empire. It was a brutal testing ground for their tactics and resilience. The Jin had immense armies, fortified cities, and advanced military technology, including gunpowder weapons used primarily for explosions and firework-like terror devices. The Mongols, however, had speed, unity, and strategic genius. Genghis Khan led his armies through passes in the Great Wall that the Jin considered impossible for a large force to traverse, achieving strategic surprise. The first major confrontation was a classic Mongol victory. At the Battle of Badger Pass, Wild Fox Ridge, in 1211, the Jin sent a massive, heavily armored army of perhaps 100,000 men to meet the invaders. The Mongols, using their signature feigned retreat, lured the Jin cavalry into a reckless pursuit, separated them from their infantry, and then annihilated them with waves of arrows from multiple directions. The Jin army, though brave, was slow, cumbersome, and poorly led compared to the fluid Mongol tumans. The Mongol victory was total. The Mongols then swept across the northern Jin plains, ravaging the countryside and pillaging countless towns. However, they hit a major obstacle they had little experience with: large, fortified cities. The Mongols were horsemen of the open plain. They had no tradition of siege warfare. Initially, they bypassed or simply looted smaller towns, but the great in astronomy is a trade with Consul, a Jin, old wild rock. In 1214, the Mongols laid siege to Zephyro. The siege was a long and difficult affair, but it demonstrated the Mongols' ability to learn and adapt with stunning speed. They used captured Chinese engineers to build trebuchets, siege towers, and catapults. They diverted rivers, mined under walls, and used human waves of captives as forced labor and shields. The siege dragged on for months, causing horrific famine inside the city. Eventually, the Jin Emperor, Xuanzong, was forced to sue for peace. He offered a massive tribute of gold, silver, silk, 500 young boys and girls, and a Jin princess for Genghis Khan's harem. The Mongols, their army strained by the siege, and perhaps wary of the city's remaining defenses, accepted the tribute and withdrew. It was a temporary respite. The Jin Emperor soon foolishly reneged on the deal, believing the Mongols had left for good. He moved his court south to the city of Kaifeng, a move Genghis Khan interpreted as a betrayal and a sign of weakness. He returned in 1215 with a vengeance. This time, the Mongol siege was relentless. The defense of Zhongdu collapsed as famine and disease ran rampant. The city fell after a horrific sack. It was looted and burned for over a month, and its population was massacred or enslaved. The conquest of northern China was not complete. The Jin would hold out in the south around Kaifeng for another 2 decades. But the Mongols had effectively broken the back of the dynasty and secured control of the north. The rewards were immense. The Mongols plundered unimaginable wealth, but more importantly, they absorbed vast numbers of engineers, administrators, scribes, and artisans. This campaign was a transformative experience. It taught the Mongols how to conquer cities. It provided them with the bureaucratic tools to administer a settled population, and it set the pattern for future conquests: overwhelming force, psychological terror, and the pragmatic adoption of subject peoples' skills. The steppe nomads were now the masters of one of the world's greatest civilizations, and they had acquired the knowledge and resources to challenge any power on Earth. The push west, the Khwarezmian catastrophe. Even as the war in China continued, an event of world historic importance occurred far to the west that would pivot the Mongol war machine toward Europe and the Islamic world: the catastrophic folly of the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire. In the early 13th century, the Khwarezmian Empire, centered in Persia and Central Asia, was a powerful and wealthy Muslim state that controlled the Silk Road trade routes. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, ruled over a vast territory from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River and saw himself as the next great conqueror of the Islamic world. In 1218, Genghis Khan, seeking to open peaceful trade relations and perhaps seeing a potential ally, sent a caravan of 500 merchants to the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, possibly suspecting them of being spies or seeking to seize their valuable goods for himself, had them all executed on the Shah's orders. Genghis Khan, still focused on mopping up operations in China, responded not with immediate war, but with diplomacy. He sent a mission of 3 diplomats, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols, to Shah Muhammad at his capital, Samarkand, demanding justice and the surrender of the governor of Otrar. The Shah's response was an act of staggering hubris. He had the chief Mongol envoy executed and shaved the beards of the other 2 before sending them back, a grave and intentional insult in Mongol and Islamic culture. This was a fatal miscalculation. For Genghis Khan, the violation of his diplomats, who were considered sacred and inviolable, was an unforgivable act of war that demanded total vengeance. He is said to have climbed a hill and prayed for 3 days and nights for guidance, vowing to unleash a punishment of biblical proportions. He then turned the full force of his attention and his army westward, leaving a subordinate general to continue the war in China. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire that began in 1219 was a masterpiece of strategic planning and utter devastation. Genghis Khan mobilized virtually his entire force, perhaps 200,000 men, and divided it into multiple armies. Instead of advancing as a single blob, they executed a multi-pronged invasion, sweeping through the empire's defenses like separate blades of a scissor. The Shah, for all his power, made critical errors. He dispersed his larger army to garrison his numerous fortified cities, believing they could withstand any siege. This played directly into Mongol hands, allowing them to defeat the Shah's forces in detail. The Mongols, now experts in siegecraft thanks to their Chinese engineers, systematically reduced the great cities of Central Asia. The city of Otra, where it all began, was the first to fall after a 5-month siege. The governor, Inalchuk, was captured. Genghis Khan had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment for his greed. Next was Bukhara, a great center of Islamic learning and a thriving city. The Mongols stormed the city, drove the inhabitants into the plain, and burned the city to the ground. The great mosque was spared, only because Genghis Khan used it as a stable for his horses, a calculated act of sacrilege to demonstrate his power over the Islamic world. The sack of Samarkand, the capital, was equally brutal. The citadel was taken, and the population was massacred despite a promise of mercy for those who surrendered, a warning to future cities that Mongol promises were void if there was any resistance. The pattern was repeated with horrifying consistency at Urgench, Merv, and Mishapur. At Merv, contemporary sources claim over 1 million people were killed, though modern historians consider this an exaggeration. The death toll was nonetheless catastrophic. The Mongols' reputation for terror was a deliberate weapon. By destroying any city that resisted and slaughtering its population, they sought to paralyze future opponents with fear. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared, though they were heavily taxed, and their artisans were drafted into Mongol service. The Shah himself fled in panic before the Mongol advance, becoming a hunted man in his own kingdom. He was pursued by 2 Tumans, 20,000 men, led by Genghis Khan's best generals, Jaber and Subutai. This pursuit became one of the greatest reconnaissance in force missions in history. The Shah died a broken man from dysentery on a small island in the Caspian Sea in 1220, but Jaber and Subutai did not turn back. On Genghis Khan's orders, they continued north, circling the Caspian Sea and crashing into the Caucasus. There, they defeated the armies of the Christian Georgian kingdom and a coalition of Alans and Cumans, a nomadic Turkic people. They then defeated a much larger Russian army at the Battle of the Kalka River in 2023 through classic Mongol feigned retreat tactics before finally turning back to rejoin the main force. The Khwarezmian campaign was more than a conquest, it was an annihilation. One of the world's most powerful empires was utterly erased from the map within a span of 2 years. The death toll was immense, numbering in the millions. The irrigation systems of Persia and Central Asia, the foundation of its agriculture and urban life for millennia, were deliberately destroyed, causing long-term ecological and economic damage from which some regions never fully recovered. But it also flung open the gates to the west. The epic reconnaissance by Jebe and Subutai had provided the Mongols with a detailed understanding of the geography, politics, and military tactics of Russia and Europe. The path for future invasions was now clear. The Islamic world was left reeling, traumatized, and vulnerable, and the storm was now poised to break upon Christendom. The successors, Ogedei, and the expansion to Europe. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 during a campaign against the Tangut Western Jar Empire, whom he accused of withholding troops, created a temporary pause in Mongol expansion. According to tradition, he was buried in a secret grave in the sacred mountains of his homeland, with the funeral procession killing any unfortunate bystanders to keep the location hidden forever. The empire was divided among his 4 sons, but supreme authority passed to his 3rd son, Ogedei Khan, after a Kurultai in 1229. Ogedei was a different kind of ruler than his father, less of a frontline warrior, but a superb organizer, politician, and diplomat. He solidified the administrative apparatus of the empire, establishing a permanent capital at Karakorum in Mongolia, a symbolic move from a nomadic to a more settled imperial structure. He created a more structured system of taxation and communication, the famous Yang relay system of horse posts that allowed messengers, officials, and merchants to race across the empire at incredible speed. Under Ogedei, the Mongol drive to conquer the world resumed with even greater force and coordination. The campaign was two-pronged, a final push to finish off the Jin in China, and a massive, coordinated invasion of the West, an operation on a scale the world had never seen. In the East, the brilliant general Subutai, now the supreme strategist of the empire, was tasked with finally extinguishing the Jin dynasty. He executed a brilliant wide-flanking maneuver, allied with the southern Song dynasty, who saw the Jin as their traditional enemy, and finally crushed the last Jin resistance at the siege of Keijo in 1234. Then, in 1235, a great Kurultai decided on a major offensive into Europe. This campaign, known as the Invasion of the Four Princes, or the Four Western March, was led by the sons of Genghis Khan's sons. Batu Khan, son of Jochi, the eldest son who had died; Dayuk, son of Ogedei; Monkey, son of Tolui, and others, all under the overall strategic command of the veteran Subutai, now in his 60s, but still a military genius. The force, perhaps 150,000 strong, was a true pan-Mongol army representing all the lineages, a testament to the unity Ogedei had thus far maintained. The invasion of Europe that began in 1236 was a systematic, unstoppable juggernaut. They first conquered the Volga Bulgars and then turned on the Russian principalities, which were divided and fought amongst themselves. The Mongols, or Tatars, as the Russians called them, took city after city in a relentless procession of horror. Ryazan was burned to the ground after a 5-day siege. Moscow, then a minor town, was captured. Vladimir was stormed and the royal family perished in a burning church. In 1240, the great city of Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, was besieged. Using battering rams and catapults, the Mongols breached the walls. The slaughter was immense. The city was razed, and its population was massacred or led away into slavery. The Russian chronicle wrote, "Great, no eye remained to weep for the dead." The Mongols then surged westward into Central Europe, splitting their forces into multiple columns to confuse and overwhelm their enemies. The Christian kingdoms of Europe were complacent and utterly unaware of the nature of the threat. They viewed the Mongols as just another barbarian horde from the steppe, and they were deeply divided by the politics of the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope. This illusion was shattered at the Battle of Legnica, in Poland on April 9, 1241. A combined European force of Polish knights, German Templars, and Teutonic knights met a Mongol army. The Europeans, relying on heavy cavalry charges, were systematically outmaneuvered. The Mongols used their classic tactics: feigned retreats, clouds of arrows that decimated the knights' unprotected horses, and smoke bombs to create confusion. The European army was annihilated. The Mongols reportedly stacked 9 sacks of the right ears of the slain in a grisly trophy mound. Meanwhile, to the south, the main Mongol force under Subutai at Batu crashed into Hungary. The European government, who writes for the right, led to the war. King Bela IV had gathered a large army, perhaps one of the largest in Europe at the time, but he made the fatal mistake of confronting the Mongols on the open plain at the Accra XTS on April 11th, 1021, just 2 days after Liegnitz. The Hungarians camped in a fortified position, surrounded by wagons. Subutai used his artillery, catapults and trebuchets to bombard the camp all night, causing terror and preventing sleep. The next morning, as the Hungarians braced for a frontal assault, Subutai sent a force to secretly cross the river and attack the camp from the rear. The result was a rout and a massacre. The Hungarian army was destroyed, and Batu's forces overran the entire country, pushing all the way to the gates of Vienna and the shores of the Adriatic Sea. Europe lay defenseless. There was no unified force left to stop the Mongols from marching to the Atlantic. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, and the Pope were busy trading insults about who was to blame. But then, in December 2021, news arrived from Mongolia. The great Khan Ogedei was dead. Mongol law required all princes to return to the capital for a Kurultai to elect a new leader. Reluctantly, Batu and Subutai gave the order to withdraw from Europe. They pulled all their forces back to the Russian steppe. Europe was saved by a political event thousands of miles away. The Mongols never returned with the same force. Batu established his own Khanate, the Golden Horde, from which he and his successors would dominate Russia for the next 250 years. But the chance to conquer all of Europe had passed. The withdrawal from Europe marked the peak of the unified Mongol Empire's expansion. The death of Ogedei opened a period of intrigue and struggle that would eventually lead to the empire's fragmentation. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace and its impact. The mid-13th century, following the death of Ogedei and the consolidation of the empire into 4 major khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, ushered in a period known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. This was the unintended but profound consequence of Mongol conquests, the creation of a single, unified political authority stretching from Korea to Hungary. For roughly a century, the Silk Road and other trade routes were under the control of one power. The Mongols, having completed their wave of destructive conquest, now focused on administration and exploitation. The result was an unprecedented era of transcontinental stability, trade, and cultural exchange that fundamentally reshaped the old world. The most immediate and visible effect was on trade. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel from the Mediterranean to the Pacific under the protection of a single authority. The Mongols actively encouraged commerce. They saw merchants as valuable sources of intelligence and tax revenue. They established and maintained the sophisticated courier system, the Yam, which consisted of a network of relay stations with fresh horses, provisions, and lodgings. This system, intended for official communications, also facilitated the movement of merchants and goods. The security of the routes dramatically lowered the risk and cost of long-distance trade. Luxury goods, Chinese silk, porcelain, and lacquerware, Persian textiles and jewels, Indonesian spices, and Middle Eastern glassware flowed westward in greater quantities than ever before. In return, silver, horses, and other goods flowed east. This commercial boom enriched the Mongol Khans and the merchant classes, particularly those from the Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, who established trading posts on the Black Sea coast, from which they could access the entire Mongol network. The Pax Mongolica also enabled an extraordinary period of cultural and intellectual exchange. With the borders open, people, ideas, and technologies moved freely across Eurasia. European missionaries and ambassadors, like the Franciscan monks Giovanni d'Appian del Capin and William of Rubruck, traveled to the Mongol court at Karakorum. sending back the first accurate accounts of the East to a hitherto ignorant and fearful Europe. Their reports describe the Mongols not as monsters, but as a highly organized and powerful people. Muslim engineers and astronomers found employment in China. Chinese innovations, such as gunpowder, the compass, papermaking, and printing, began their westward journey, where they would eventually revolutionize European warfare, navigation, and thought. The Mongol Khans themselves were remarkably religiously tolerant. Unlike many empires, they did not impose their native shamanistic beliefs on their subjects. Genghis Khan's Yasa decreed tolerance for all religions, as he believed that all faiths could appeal to the eternal blue heaven for favor. At the Mongol court, Buddhist lamas, Muslim imams, Christian Nestorians, and Taoist priests all debated and practiced their faiths freely. This policy was pragmatic. It prevented religious unrest among their diverse subjects, but it also facilitated the exchange of religious ideas and texts. The administrative practices of the empire were also a form of exchange. The Mongols were master synthesizers, drawing on the bureaucratic expertise of their conquered peoples. In Persia, they used Persian administrators. In China, they adopted Chinese models of government, though they often placed Mongols in the top positions. They created a universal script for the Mongolian language based on the Uyghur alphabet. They conducted censuses and standardized weights and measures across the empire to facilitate taxation. Perhaps the most famous traveler to benefit from the Pax Mongolica was the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. His journey along the Silk Road in the 1370s, his 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, and the subsequent book of his travels, Il Millionaire, provided Europeans with a detailed and captivating, if sometimes exaggerated, glimpse of the immense wealth and sophistication of the East, particularly China. His descriptions of paper money, coal, and the grandeur of Chinese cities fueled European dreams of Asia for centuries and would later inspire explorers like Christopher Columbus. The Pax Mongolica was not a piece of enlightenment. It was a peace imposed by overwhelming force and maintained for pragmatic economic reasons. It was built on the bones of the millions who had perished during the conquests. But its effects were undeniably transformative. It broke down centuries of isolation between East and West, accelerated technological diffusion, and created the first truly globalized world system, setting the stage for the age of exploration that would follow its eventual collapse. Zephyros, it was, in a cruel irony, the Mongols' greatest gift to world history. Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty in China. Among the successors of Genghis Khan, his grandson Kublai Khan stands as one of the most significant and fascinating figures. His reign represents both the zenith of Mongol prestige and the beginning of its fundamental transformation and fragmentation. Kublai was the second son of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son.
While his brother Mongke became Great Khan in 1251, he tasked Kublai with managing the Mongol territories in China. Kublai quickly developed a deep appreciation for Chinese culture and administration, setting up a court in Kaiping, later renamed Shangdu, that blended Mongol and Chinese traditions. His great ambition was to become the ruler of all China, which meant conquering the wealthy and populous southern Song dynasty. This was a formidable challenge. The Song were a sophisticated enemy, possessing a large navy and fortified cities along the Yangtze River system and a culture of fierce resistance. Kublai's campaign against the Song was a long and arduous war of attrition that lasted over a decade. He relied heavily on Chinese advisors and defectors and built his own navy, using it to outflank Song positions. The siege of the key twin cities of Xiangyang and Fancheng lasted from 1268 to 1023 and was a turning point. The Mongols used massive counterweight trebuchets, built by Persian engineers, to finally breach the walls. The Song resistance collapsed soon after. In 1276, the Song capital Hangzhou surrendered peacefully, and by 1279, the last vestiges of Song resistance were crushed at the naval battle of Yamen, where the last child emperor drowned. But with this, Kublai Khan became the first non-Chinese ruler to conquer all of China. He proclaimed the Hun dynasty in 1271, even before the conquest was complete.
Yuan, meaning that origin is not all right. Krano signified a new beginning under a universal ruler. He moved the capital from Karakoram in Mongolia to a new city he built in China, Dadu, great capital, which would later become Beijing. His summer capital was at Chengdu, the fabled Xanadu of Coleridge's poem. Kublai's rule over China was a complex balancing act. He presented himself as a legitimate Chinese emperor, adopting Chinese court rituals, building temples, and commissioning historical works to place the Yuan within the orthodox line of Chinese dynasties. He maintained the traditional Chinese bureaucratic structure, but ensured that the top positions were held by Mongols or trusted foreigners like Marco Polo's family, while Chinese officials were largely confined to lower-level posts. He also implemented a strict ethnic hierarchy. Mongols were at the top, followed by various categories of non-Chinese, Central Asians, Persians, Arabs, etc., known as Semu, with ethnic Northern Chinese, Hanren, below them, and Southern Chinese, Nanren, at the very bottom. This policy prevented assimilation, but also fostered deep resentment. Despite this, Kublai's reign was a time of great prosperity and cultural flourishing. He maintained and expanded the Grand Canal to transport grain to his capital. He encouraged international trade, welcoming merchants from across Eurasia. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, and his court was a dazzling spectacle of multiculturalism. Tibetan Buddhism became the favored religion of the court, and the Tibetan monk Phagspa was appointed to create a new universal script, the Phagspa script, to write all the languages of the empire. However, Kublai's focus on China came at a cost to the unity of the wider Mongol Empire. The other Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, increasingly saw themselves as independent states. Kublai's claim to the title of Great Khan was disputed, particularly after his failed invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, which were thwarted by typhoons, the legendary kamikaze or divine winds, and costly campaigns in Vietnam and Java. These military failures, combined with his extravagant spending on projects and ceremonies, strained the empire's economy. Kublai Khan died in 1294, a melancholic and overweight man, having outlived his favorite wife Chabi and his chosen heir. The Yuan dynasty would continue for another 17 full years, but it grew progressively weaker. The Mongols in China became Sinicized and lost their martial edge, while the Chinese never accepted them as legitimate rulers. The Yuan dynasty represents the ultimate paradox of the Mongol Empire. In conquering China, Kublai achieved the empire's greatest prize, but in doing so, he effectively abandoned the steppe heritage that had made the Mongols powerful, and his focus on China accelerated the breakup of the unified empire. He was the last of the great Khans to command any real authority over the whole Mongol world. The Ilkhanate, Mongols in the Islamic world. While Kublai Khan was establishing himself in China, another branch of the Mongol family was carving out a domain in the heart of the Islamic world. This realm, known as the Alta Khanate, meaning subordinate Khanate, acknowledging, at least nominally, the supremacy of the Great Khan in China, was founded by Esti Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis Khan and brother of both Monkey and Kublai. In 1255, the great Khan Monkey tasked Hulagu with a specific mission: to solidify Mongol control over Persia and to subdue or destroy the remaining powers in the Middle East, most notably the Assamili assassins, Nizari Ismailis, and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Hulagu's campaign was a continuation of the Mongol world conquest. His army was immense and included 1,000 Chinese engineers specializing in siege warfare. His first target was the mountain fortresses of the Assassins in Persia. The Assassins, a feared Shia sect known for their political murders and unwavering loyalty to their Grand Master, had evaded previous rulers for centuries. Hulagu methodically besieged and captured their strongholds between 1253 and 1256. Their Grand Master, Ruk al-Din Harsha, surrendered and was later killed. The Mongol destruction of the Assassin Order was welcomed by both Sunnis and Christians, who had also been their targets. Hulagu then turned his attention to the grand prize, Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliph and the symbolic center of the Sunni Islamic world which was considered in the land. The progress of the chaos was pain. The Caliph, al-Mustas, was politically weak, but arrogantly confident in the spiritual status of his office. He refused Hulagu's demands to surrender, believing that Allah would never allow the city to fall to infidels. It was a catastrophic mistake. The Mongol siege of Baghdad began in January 1958. The city's defenses were no match for Hulagu's siege engines. The dikes along the Tigris River were broken, flooding the city's hinterland and preventing escape. After a brief siege, the walls were breached. The city fell on February 10, 1958. What followed was one of the most destructive sacks in history. The Mongols looted and burned the city for days. The great library of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, was destroyed, with its books thrown into the Tigris River, which was said to have run black with ink and red with blood. Most significantly, the Caliph al-Mustasin was captured. According to legend, Hulagu, having a taboo against spilling royal blood, had him rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The death of the Caliph sent a shockwave through the entire Islamic world, symbolizing the utter collapse of the old order. With Baghdad destroyed, Hulagu continued westward, conquering Syria and menacing the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. However, in 1260 news arrived of the death of his brother, the great Khan Monkey. Hulagu, like Batu before him, withdrew with the bulk of his army to participate in the succession struggle, leaving behind a smaller force under his general Kitbuga. The Mamluks of Egypt, a military slave dynasty, seized their chance. They marched north and met the Mongol army at the Battle of Ain Jalut, Spring of Goliath, in Palestine, on September 3, 1964. The Mamluks, using tactics they had learned from the Mongols themselves and fighting with a religious fervor, defeated the Mongol force and killed Kitbuga. Ain Jalut was a hugely significant battle. It was the first major defeat of a Mongol army and marked the high water mark of their westward expansion. The Mongols were never able to seriously threaten the Mamluk heartland again. The Ilkhanate settled into ruling Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia. Initially, they continued their anti-Islamic policies, favoring Buddhists and Christians. Hulagu's wife, Dox Khatun, was an influential Nestorian Christian. However, over time, the Ilkhans, surrounded by a Muslim population, began to convert. In 1295, the Ilkhan Ghazan formally converted to Islam, making it the state religion. This began a cultural renaissance in Persia under Mongol rule. The Ilkhans became great patrons of Persian art, architecture, and history. They built magnificent tombs like the Sultaniyye, mosques, and observatories. The great historian Rashid al-Din served as vizier and produced his monumental Jami al-Tawarikh, Compendium of Chronicles, a history of the world that reflected the vast cosmopolitan scope of the Mongol Empire. The empire became a center of learning and culture, though it was constantly at war with its Mongol cousins, the Golden Horde, over control of the Caucasus and the Mamluks of Egypt. The Ilkhanate eventually disintegrated in the mid-14th century after the death of its last strong ruler, Abu Sa'id, but its legacy was the revitalization of Persian culture under a new rule. Mongol-infused dynasty that paved the way for the Timurids and later the Safavids. So, the Golden Horde, the Mongol rule of Russia. The vast northwestern quadrant of the Mongol Empire, the Ulis granted to Genghis Khan's eldest son, Jochi, evolved into the Khanate known as the actual Horde, a term derived from the color of the royal tent, or perhaps from the Turkic word orda, meaning camp. Under Jochi's son, Batu Khan, and his successor, Berke, this Khanate established a dominion over Russia that would last for nearly 250 years, profoundly shaping the course of Russian history, identity, and statecraft. The Golden Horde's heartland was the Kipchak steppe, modern-day southern Russia and Ukraine. Their capital was at Sarai on the Volga River, a large and cosmopolitan city that was a hub of trade. From here, they ruled not through direct administration, but through a system of indirect control and terror. They did not occupy the Russian forest zones. Instead, they subjugated the numerous Russian principalities, such as Kiev, Vladimir, Novgorod, and Moscow, and reduced them to tributary states. The relationship was simple and brutal. The Russian princes had to journey to Sarai to pledge allegiance to the Khan and receive a Yalik charter that confirmed their right to rule. In return, they were responsible for collecting and delivering a heavy tribute to the Mongols. Any sign of disnandal terror. The Mongols themselves rarely settled in the Russian forests. They preferred the open steppe that reminded them of home. They collected taxes through Muslim financiers from Central Asia and relied on native princes to enforce their will. The impact of this, Katayok, as it came to be known in Russian history, was multifaceted and is still debated by historians. Economically, it was a massive drain. The constant tribute impoverished the principalities and slowed economic development for centuries. 100. Many artistic skills, such as masonry, were lost. Politically, however, Mongol rule had unintended consequences that ultimately strengthened and centralized Russia. The Mongols dismantled the old decentralized Veche public assembly system of city-states like Novgorod and reinforced the concept of autocratic, centralized rule, which Russian princes eagerly adopted. They had no interest in dealing with democratic assemblies. They preferred a single prince who could be held responsible. Crucially, they consistently backed the princes of Moscow as their primary tax collectors. This privileged position allowed Moscow to grow in wealth and power at the expense of its rivals, like Tver. The Moscow princes used the power and wealth granted by the Mongols to gradually expand their territory and, eventually, to overthrow their masters. The Golden Horde itself was not a monolithic state. It was divided into two main wings, the Blue Horde, Eastern, and the White Horde, Western, and later splintered into smaller khanates, like the Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimean khanates. As a result, in some peaks of Maven, unrelated.
The Mongols of the Golden Horde, who were Turkic-speaking and increasingly Muslim, gradually assimilated with the local Kipchak Turkic population, becoming known as Tatars. In the late 14th century, the Golden Horde was briefly reunified under the powerful Khan Toktamash. However, he challenged the great Turco-Mongol conqueror Timur Tamerlane, who was building his own empire in Central Asia. In a series of campaigns in the 1390s, Timur invaded the Golden Horde's territories, sacked Sarai, and shattered its army. This defeat broke the power of the Golden Horde irrevocably. Taking advantage of this weakness, the Grand Prince of Moscow began to assert independence. Dmitry Donskoy won a symbolic victory against a Mongol army at the Battle of Kulikovo Field in 1380, earning him the title Donskoy of the Don. Though the Mongols sacked Moscow in retaliation 2 years later, the spell of their invincibility was broken. A century later, in 1480, Prince Ivan III of Moscow formally renounced Mongol authority after the Don.
Great stand on the Ogur River, where the Mongol and Russian armies faced off but dispersed without a fight, marking the end of Mongol domination. The legacy of the Golden Horde is deeply embedded in Russia. It shaped its centralized autocracy, its military organization, its postal system, and its vocabulary. Words like dengi for money and loshed for horse are of Turkic origin. It also left a lasting ethnic and cultural presence through the Tatar populations of modern Russia, a permanent reminder of the centuries when Russian princes bowed to the descendants of Genghis Khan. The decline and fragmentation, the breaking of the empire. The Mongol Empire, forged by the will of Genghis Khan and expanded by his descendants, was ultimately too vast and too diverse to hold together. The centrifugal forces of geography, culture, and ambition proved stronger than the centripetal force of a shared imperial ideology. The decline was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process of fragmentation over the 14th century, driven by a combination of internal strife, poor leadership, and the inevitable assimilation of the conquerors into the conquered cultures. The first and most critical crack was the Attition problem. Unlike the Chinese or Byzantine systems of primogeniture, the Mongol tradition required that a new Khan be elected by a Kurultai of the royal family and nobles. This created a power vacuum after every death, leading to intense intrigue, factionalism, and often civil war. The period after the death of Kublai Khan in 1294 was particularly messy. The Yuan dynasty in China was plagued by weak and short-lived emperors, palace coups, and financial instability caused by hyperinflation from paper money. Between 1308 and 1333, 8 emperors ruled, most dying young under suspicious circumstances. The other Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Chagatai Khanate, effectively became independent, pursuing their own interests and often warring with each other. The idea of a unified Mongol Empire governed by a great Khan in Karakoram, or Khan Balik, became a fiction. A second major cause of decline was the actual loss of Mongol identity. The Mongols were a tiny minority ruling over vast populations of Chinese, Persians, Turks, and Russians. Over time, they could not help but be absorbed. The Ilkhans in Persia converted to Islam and became patrons of Persian culture. The Khans of the Golden Horde became Turkicized Muslims. The One emperors in China became steeped in Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese court culture. As they assimilated, they lost the very qualities, the steppe hardness, the military discipline, the meritocratic ethos that had made them conquerors. They became distant from the armies that sustained them, and often succumbed to the luxuries and decadence of their settled subjects. The Mongol military, once the terror of the world, grew soft and lost its tactical edge. Furthermore, the Black Death in the mid-14th century was a catastrophic blow that struck the entire Mongol world. The Pax Mongolica, which had facilitated trade, also facilitated the spread of disease. The plague likely traveled along the Silk Road from Central Asia to the Black Sea ports of the Golden Horde, and thence to Europe. The Mongol Khanates, which controlled these trade routes, were devastated by the pandemic, which killed a huge portion of the population, disrupted the economy, and further weakened administrative control. The plague was seen by many as a sign of heavenly displeasure with the ruling Khans. The end came at different times in different places. The Il Khanate in Persia disintegrated into civil war after the death of its last strong ruler, Abu Sa'id, in 1335, breaking up into smaller, squabbling states ruled by petty dynasties. The Golden Horde was shattered by Timur's invasion in the 1490s, and then slowly fragmented into smaller khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, Siberia, that were picked off one by a rising Russia over the next 2 centuries. The Yuan dynasty in China was overthrown by a massive peasant rebellion, the Red Turban Rebellion, which was fueled by famine, flooding of the Yellow River, and deep-seated hatred of a major peasant dropped by a combat called Indian Law. The open center of the capital, Khanate-Sahedra. In 1368, the rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang captured Dadu and drove the Mongols back to their steppe homeland, establishing the native Chinese Ming dynasty. The Mongols retreated to Mongolia, where they returned to their traditional tribal patterns and internecine warfare, never again to threaten the world on such a scale. The empire of Genghis Khan was no more. It had broken into its constituent parts, and its successors were eventually absorbed or destroyed by the settled civilizations it had once dominated. The era of the world conquerors was over, but the world they left behind was forever changed. The legacy of the Mongol Empire. Though the unified Mongol Empire lasted for less than a century, its impact on world history was profound and enduring. It was an era of terrifying destruction, but also of unprecedented connection, a paradox that defines its legacy. The most immediate legacy was one of demographic and psychological trauma. The scale of death and destruction inflicted during the conquests was staggering, with modern estimates suggesting that as much as 10% of the world's population may have perished. Entire regions were depopulated, and great cities were reduced to ruins. The memory of the Mongol invasions left a deep scar on the psyche of conquered peoples from China to Hungary, a benchmark for horror and devastation that would last for generations. In many ways, the Black Death was the final, biological chapter of the Mongol conquests. Its spread enabled by the connectivity the Mongols had created. Yet, from this destruction emerged a new world order. The Pax Mongolica created the first truly interconnected Eurasia. By securing the Silk Road, the Mongols enabled an explosive growth in transcontinental trade. Goods, ideas, and technologies moved freely from one end of the continent to the other for the first time. Chinese gunpowder, printing, and navigational technology began their journey west, where they would later revolutionize European warfare and exploration. Conversely, Persian astronomy and Muslim medical knowledge flowed east into China. This great exchange, facilitated by Mongol tolerance and their thirst for useful knowledge, was a catalyst for future global development. It can be argued that the European Renaissance was partly funded by, and certainly informed by, the knowledge and trade that flowed from the East during the Pax Mongolica. The empire also had a decisive impact on the political geography of the modern world. The destruction of the old order in the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Khwarezmian Empire, cleared the way for the later rise of the Ottoman Empire. In Russia, Mongol rule forged the autocratic centralized state of Muscovy, which would eventually become the Russian Empire. The Ming dynasty in China defined itself in opposition to the barbarian Yuan. The boundaries of the Khanates loosely presaged modern borders in the Middle East and Central Asia. The Mongols were also great synthesizers and patrons. The Ilkhanids in Persia became renowned patrons of Persian art and history, producing magnificent illustrated manuscripts. The Yuan dynasty in China encouraged Tibetan Buddhism and sponsored a vibrant cultural scene that blended Chinese, Mongol, and Central Asian influences. The transmission of knowledge was a key feature. The Mongol court was a clearinghouse for ideas from across the known world. The sheer scale of the empire forced a new global awareness. For Europe, the Mongol invasions were initially a terrifying mystery. The sudden appearance of unknown invaders they called Tartars, from Tartarus, hell. The missions and travelogues of figures like Karpini, Rubruk, and especially Marco Polo, however, opened their eyes to the vastness and sophistication of Asia. This knowledge shattered the isolation of medieval Europe and planted the seeds of the desire for direct trade routes to the east, a desire that would ultimately drive the age of exploration and Columbus's voyage in 1492. In the end, the legacy of the Mongol Empire is one of contradiction. They were destroyers on an apocalyptic scale, yet they were also the unwitting facilitators of the first age of globalization. There were nomadic outsiders who showed a remarkable capacity to adopt and adapt the best practices of the advanced civilizations they conquered. They were a force of both immense chaos and unprecedented order. The modern world, with its interconnectedness and its blurred boundaries between East and West, is in many ways a product of the brief, violent, and transformative moment when the nomads of the steppe ruled the world. Their empire vanished, but the world it created remained. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more history documentaries, and tell us in the comments which part of this documentary was most interesting to you. Thank you for watching and being a part of our journey through history, and we'll see you in the next documentary.